They laughed when he paid for her freedom, but by sunrise, not a single man in that town would meet his eyes. The sun sat high and dry over Red Hollow, baking the dust into something that clung to boots and memory alike. And Ethan Cole rode in with nothing on his mind but grain, 40 pounds of it if the price hadn't climbed again, just enough to get his cattle through another week of stubborn heat and thinning pasture, because out where he lived, 12 miles past the last fence line anyone bothered to mend, survival wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, repetitive, and usually unnoticed. His hat was pulled low, his coat worn thin at the elbows, and the kind of man he'd become was the kind people forgot even while looking straight at him, which suited him just fine until the moment the town didn't feel right, until the usual noise of wagons and loose talk and piano keys slipping through open saloon doors seemed to fold in on itself, replaced by something tighter, something watching. He slowed his horse without meaning to, leather creaking beneath him, nostrils catching the faint scent of sweat and sunburned wood and something else. Tension, the kind that gathers before a storm but never brings rain. A small crowd had formed near the center of the street, not loud, not restless, just standing, as if waiting for something they had already agreed upon without saying it out loud. And Ethan could have ridden past, could have kept his eyes forward like every other man who preferred his life uncomplicated. But there was a stillness in that circle that didn't belong to ordinary trouble, so he reined in, boots hitting dirt with a dull thud as he stepped down, dust rising slow around his heels. He didn't push through at first, just watched the edges, the way shoulders shifted but didn't break, the way no one spoke above a murmur, until he saw her, kneeling in the dirt, wrists bound. Dark hair falling forward like a curtain, she didn't bother to move, her dress worn but clean in a way that suggested pride hadn't left her, not yet. And her eyes weren't searching the crowd, weren't begging, weren't accusing, they were steady, fixed somewhere beyond the line of men who refused to meet them, as if she had already stepped outside whatever judgment was about to fall. Someone near Ethan muttered something about theft, about rules, about her kind, words that hung in the air like they'd been used too many times to mean anything honest anymore. And Ethan felt it then, not anger, not yet, but a weight, the kind that settles in your chest when you realize a moment is happening whether you choose it or not. And he understood something simple and dangerous all at once. No one here was going to move. No one here was going to cross that invisible line drawn. People hear themselves. He glanced down at the small sack beside the man's boot. Grain. Not much, maybe 20 pounds at most, the kind of amount that could keep someone alive for a few days if stretched careful, and something in his chest tightened at the simplicity of it, at how small the line was between need and punishment out here. And the cost? Ethan asked, already knowing the answer would not sit right. And the man shrugged like it did not matter, like none of this did, more than she has, he said, which drew a few low murmurs from the crowd. Agreement without ownership. And that was when Ethan reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the coins he had counted twice before riding in. Coins that had weight because they meant another week, maybe two, of keeping things going out on land that did not forgive mistakes. He held them there for a moment, feeling the edges press into his palm, and in that pause, the world seemed to narrow to something simple and clear, not easy, but clear, the kind of clarity that only shows up when there is nothing left to hide behind. He stepped forward another pace and let the coins fall into the man's waiting hand without ceremony. The metal sound sharp against the quiet, and for a heartbeat no one moved, as if the act itself had broken something unseen. That covers it, Ethan said, not asking, not bargaining, just stating it like a fact that had already settled, and the man blinked, surprised more by the lack of hesitation than the payment itself. Before giving a short nod and stepping back, the rope loosened, then removed, dropped into the dust like it had never mattered. The girl did not stand right away. She flexed her hands slowly, feeling them again, then rose with a steadiness that did not match the situation, brushing the dirt from her dress with calm, deliberate movements. And when she turned to Ethan, there was still no gratitude in her expression, only that same quiet awareness, as if she understood the cost better than he did. The crowd shifted, voices starting again in low tones, but none of them stepped closer, none of them met Ethan's eyes, and he realized then that something had changed, not out loud, not in a way that could be pointed to, but in the space between people, in the way they now kept their distance from him like he had crossed a line they could not follow. He exhaled, long and slow, and reached for the reins of his horse, already feeling the absence of the grain he had come for, already knowing the ride back would be longer than before, and as he swung into the saddle, he did not look back to see if she would follow, because some things, once set in motion, did not need to be asked. The road out of Red Hollow stretched long and pale under the afternoon sun, a thin ribbon of dust cutting through land that offered no comfort and no questions. And Ethan Cole kept his eyes forward as his horse settled into a steady rhythm, hooves beating soft and even against the dry earth. But he could feel it before he heard it, the presence behind him, light, unhurried, not hiding, not chasing, just there. He did not turn at first, because turning would make it real, and something about the quiet between them felt fragile, like it might break if acknowledged too soon. So he rode on, counting the miles in silence, the heat pressing down against his shoulders, the horizon wavering in that distant shimmer that made everything look uncertain. It was not until the town had long disappeared behind them, until the only sounds left were wind and leather and the occasional call of something unseen in the distance, that he finally slowed his horse and glanced back, just enough to confirm what he already knew. She walked a few yards behind, steady, unhurried, her steps matching the land as if she had always belonged to it, as if the dust did not cling to her but moved aside. "You do not have to follow," Ethan said after a moment, his voice carrying back to her without force, just a statement laid out between them, and she stopped then, not out of hesitation, but as if acknowledging the space his words created. For a brief second, neither of them moved, the wind slipping between them like a third presence. And then she spoke, her voice calm, measured, carrying the weight of someone who chose each word carefully. "I was not following," she said, and there was no challenge in it, no defiance, only truth shaped differently than he expected. Ethan studied her then, really looked, noticing the way she stood balanced, neither guarded nor open, the way her eyes did not search his face for permission or approval, and something about that unsettled him again, because he had expected gratitude, or at least confusion, something that fit into the world he understood. But this felt like something else entirely. He shifted in the saddle, glancing ahead toward the stretch of land that would lead to his place, 12 miles. Wooden house with a sagging porch, a windmill that turned only when it felt like it, and a corral that held more silence than cattle these days. But as he rode closer, something about it felt different, not because anything had changed, but because he was not arriving alone anymore. He swung down from the saddle with a quiet grunt, boots hitting familiar ground, and for a moment he stood there, holding the reins loosely, as if waiting for something to explain itself. But nothing did. Not the house, not the land, not the woman who had stopped a few steps behind him and now stood looking out over the property, as if reading it the way one might read a story written in a language only partially understood. "This is it," Ethan said after a while, his voice carrying the weight of something that used to mean more, and she nodded once, not impressed, not disappointed, just acknowledging the truth of it. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint scent of dry grass and distant water that had not been seen in weeks, and Ethan led his horse toward the corral, the familiar creak of the gate sounding louder than usual in the quiet. And as he moved through the motions of removing the saddle and brushing the dust from the animal's back, he became aware of her presence again, not close, not distant, just there, observing without interfering, and it made each movement feel deliberate, as if he were being watched not with suspicion, but with purpose. When he finished, he turned toward the house, hesitating only slightly before gesturing toward the porch. "You can rest there if you want," he said, not quite offering, not quite refusing, and she stepped forward without hesitation, her movements calm and steady as she crossed the yard, her eyes taking in every detail, the worn boards, the uneven steps, the way the door hung slightly off its frame. Inside, the air was cooler, shaded from the sun, carrying the faint scent of wood and thyme, and Ethan moved to the small table near the window, setting down his hat and running a hand through his hair, as if trying to reset something that no longer fit the same way. He reached for a tin cup, filled it from a jug, and set it on the table without looking at her. "Water," he said simply, and she approached, not hurried, not cautious, just present, taking the cup with a small nod before drinking, her gaze drifting toward the window as if measuring the land beyond. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but not settled either, and Ethan found himself glancing toward the empty corner where sacks of grain should have been stacked, where something practical should have justified the trip, and the absence of it sat heavier than expected. "There is not enough out here," he said after a moment, more to himself than to her, and she set the cup down gently, the soft sound against the wood carrying further than it should have. "There is enough for what is needed," she replied, and again, the simplicity of her words unsettled him, because they did not argue, they did not explain, they simply existed. Outside, the light shifted further, the sky beginning to soften into evening, and somewhere in the distance, a faint sound echoed across the land, something too far to define but too deliberate to ignore, and Ethan paused, his head turning slightly as he listened. The rhythm unfamiliar yet steady, and though it faded as quickly as it came, it left something behind, a quiet certainty that whatever had followed him from the town had not yet finished revealing itself. The sound did not return right away, and for a while it could have been mistaken for imagination, the kind that comes from too much silence and not enough certainty. But Ethan did not move from where he stood, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the window where the land stretched flat and open, because he had lived out here long enough to know the difference between nothing and something that had not yet arrived. The light faded slower now, the sky shifting from harsh white to a softer amber that painted the edges of everything in long, uncertain lines, and behind him, he could hear the faint movements of the woman as she stepped back outside onto the porch, her footsteps light against the worn wood, and though she said nothing, her presence seemed to settle into the place as if it had been expected all along. Ethan stepped out after her, resting one hand against the frame of the door, his gaze scanning the horizon again. And there it was, faint at first, then clearer, a distant rhythm carried by the wind, steady, deliberate, not hurried but not wandering either, and this time he did not question it, because he knew what it meant even before he could see it. She stood at the edge of the porch, her posture unchanged, her eyes following the same line, and for the first time since he had met her, there was something different in the air between them, not tension, not distance, but recognition of what was coming. "You knew," Ethan said quietly, not accusing, not surprised, just stating it as the realization settled into place, and she did not look at him when she answered. "I knew they would come," she said, her voice carrying no urgency, only certainty, and that was when Ethan felt it fully, not fear, but the weight of something larger than himself, something that had begun long before he stepped into that town and would continue long after this moment passed. The shapes appeared slowly against the fading light, small at first, then forming into figures that moved with a purpose the land itself seemed to recognize, riders, more than a handful, their silhouettes rising and falling with the rhythm of their horses, not spread out, not chaotic, but aligned in a way that spoke of discipline and intent. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand dropping from the doorframe to rest at his side, and though every instinct told him to measure the situation, to prepare, to understand what might come next, something else held him still, something quieter, the same feeling that had led him to step forward back in town when no one else would. Beside him, she did not move, did not step forward or back. She simply stood, watching, and in that stillness, Ethan began to understand that whatever was about to happen was not his to control, not in the way he was used to, not with hands or decisions or coin, but with something else entirely. The riders drew closer, the sound of hooves now clear against the earth, carrying across the distance with a rhythm that seemed almost ceremonial, and yet there was no raised voice, no sign of threat, only presence. And as the first of them reached the edge of his land, slowing without command, Ethan realized that this was not a moment of conflict, not the kind he had known before, but something heavier, something that would not be decided by force or words alone. He glanced once toward her, just enough to see that her expression had not changed, that same calm, that same quiet awareness, and in that glance, a final understanding settled into place, that the choice he had made in that town had not ended when the coins left his hand. It had only begun, and now, standing on the edge of his own land with the last light of day fading behind him. Ethan Cole understood that what came next would not be about what he had done, but about what it meant. The riders did not rush the land. They entered it the way wind crosses open ground, steady, certain, without asking permission and without needing to. And Ethan stood where he was as the first horse came to a stop a few yards beyond his fence line. The animal calm beneath its rider, its breath slow in the cooling air, and behind it, more figures followed, not crowding, not spreading, but holding a shape that felt deliberate, like something practiced over time. No one reached for anything, no voice broke the quiet, and yet the weight of their presence filled the space more than any noise could have, and Ethan felt it settle across his shoulders, not as a threat, but as something that required him to stand exactly as he was, neither stepping forward nor back. The man at the front dismounted first, his movement smooth, unhurried, boots touching the ground with a quiet certainty, and when he lifted his gaze, it did not search, it found, moving past Ethan only for a brief moment before, resting on the woman beside him. And in that look, something passed between them that needed no words, something older than the town, older than the lines men drew in dust and called law. Ethan glanced toward her, expecting something to change, a shift, a reaction, but she remained as she had been, steady, grounded, her presence neither shrinking nor expanding, simply aligning with what had arrived. The man took a few steps forward then, stopping just short of the porch, his posture upright, not imposing, not yielding, and when he spoke, his voice carried low and even, shaped by years of saying only what was necessary. You brought her away from judgment that was not yours to give, he said, and though the words could have been taken many ways, there was no accusation in them, only recognition. Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes steady. I paid what they asked, he replied, not as a defense, but as a truth he could stand on, and the man studied him for a moment, not measuring strength, not testing resolve, but looking for something less visible, something that could not be spoken aloud. Behind him, the riders remained still, their attention present but not pressing, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a moment that did not belong to haste. Then the man reached into a small pouch at his side and withdrew something wrapped in cloth, holding it for a second before stepping forward and placing it carefully on the edge of the porch, not offering it directly, not forcing it into Ethan's hands, just setting it there as if returning something that had never truly been his to keep. What is given freely changes more than what is taken, the man said quietly, and then he stepped back, the space between them returning as naturally as it had closed. Ethan looked down at the object, the cloth worn but clean, tied with a simple strip of leather, and for a moment he did not reach for it, because something about the gesture felt heavier than the coins he had handed over in town, heavier than the ride, heavier than the silence that had followed. And when he finally did move, his hand slow as it reached out, he understood that, whatever this was, it was not payment, not in the way he knew it, but something else entirely, something that carried meaning he had not yet learned how to hold. The cloth felt lighter than Ethan expected when he finally picked it up, but the weight of it settled somewhere deeper, somewhere that had nothing to do with his hands. And for a moment he just stood there on the edge of the porch, the fading light stretching shadows long across the ground while the riders remained still, waiting without impatience, as if time itself had slowed to match whatever this moment required. He loosened the leather tie carefully, not out of caution, but out of instinct. The kind that comes when something does not belong to you, yet still asks to be understood. And as the cloth opened, he saw what lay inside, a small bundle of earth, dark and rich in a way that did not match the dry land beneath his boots, held together in a shallow wrap, simple, unadorned, yet carrying a presence that made him pause. He glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting the man's again, searching for explanation, but none was offered. Only that same steady gaze that did not instruct, did not guide, simply allowed him to find his own meaning. Ethan looked back, down at the soil, letting it rest in his palm, feeling its texture, its difference, and something shifted in him then, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady, like a realization that had been waiting for the right moment to settle into place. This land is yours, the man said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach him. But now, it knows you. And the words hung in the air, not as a claim, not as a promise, but as something that could not be undone once spoken. Ethan frowned. Slightly, not in confusion, but in the way a man does when he begins to understand something he has never been taught. His gaze drifting out across his property, the worn fences, the dry patches of earth, the places where nothing had grown in seasons, and for the first time, he saw it not as something he endured, but as something that had been waiting, not for rain, not for luck, but for something else entirely. Beside him, the woman stepped forward then, her movement quiet, her presence aligning with the moment as naturally as it had since the beginning. And when she looked at the soil in his hand, there was no surprise in her eyes, only recognition, as if this had always been part of the path he had stepped onto the moment he chose not to turn away. "You gave without asking," she said softly, her voice carrying a calm that matched the land around them. "So now you receive without taking." And Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that carried more than air, his fingers closing slightly around the earth as if grounding himself in something he could not yet fully explain. The wind moved through the field then, gentle, steady, carrying with it a scent that had not been there before, faint but present, and the horses shifted quietly beyond the fence, their movements relaxed, untroubled, as if the tension that had arrived with the riders had already passed without ever becoming something else. Ethan lifted his head, his eyes moving from the land to the horizon and back again, and though nothing had visibly changed, though the fences still leaned and the ground still looked the same to anyone passing by, he knew, without knowing how, that something had shifted in a way that would not be seen all at once, but would reveal itself over time, in quiet ways, in small changes that built into something larger. He looked back at the man, then at the riders beyond, and there was no need for further words, no agreement to be made, no understanding to be confirmed, because whatever had been given had already taken root, not in the soil alone, but in the space between choice and consequence. And as the last light of day settled into dusk, Ethan Cole realized that the life he had known had not been taken from him. It had been expanded into something he had not known how to ask for, something that had found him only because he had not turned away. The riders did not linger after that, not in the way men usually do when they expect something in return. There was no final word, no gesture to seal what had already been understood. The man simply gave a slight nod, not to Ethan alone but to the moment itself, and turned back toward his horse, his movement as calm as when he had arrived, and one by one the others followed, their silhouettes shifting against the dimming sky as they mounted and began to ride out, not hurried, not looking back, as if their purpose had been fulfilled long before Ethan realized what it was. The sound of hooves faded slowly into the distance, swallowed by the same land that had carried them in, until there was nothing left but the wind again, soft and steady, brushing across the dry grass and the edges of the worn fence. And Ethan stood there for a long while, the small bundle still resting in his hand, watching the empty horizon where they had disappeared, not expecting them to return, not needing them to. Beside him, she remained, her presence unchanged, but something in the air between them had shifted, not in distance, but in clarity, as if the space they shared had finally found its shape. "You will not see them again," she said quietly, her voice carrying no sadness, only certainty, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze still fixed on the land. "I figured that," he replied, and there was no regret in it, no question, just acceptance of something that did not need to be explained. The night began to settle then, slow and deliberate, the sky deepening into a dark blue that stretched wide and endless above them, the first stars appearing one by one, faint at first, then clearer, and Ethan turned back toward the house, his movements unhurried, as if he had stepped into a rhythm he had not known before. He walked to the edge of the yard and crouched down, his hand lowering toward the ground. And for a moment he hesitated, not because he doubted, but because he understood that this small act would not be undone. And then he pressed the soil gently into the earth beneath him, not burying it, not hiding it, simply placing it where it could meet the land that had waited so long without asking anything in return. The dirt looked no different when he pulled his hand away. No sign marked the place, no change announced itself, But Ethan remained there for a moment longer, his fingers brushing the surface as if listening for something that could not be heard. When he stood again, he noticed at first in the air a faint shift, something subtle, like the beginning of rain that had not yet fallen. And then in the quiet around him, the way the land seemed to settle, not in stillness, but in something closer to ease. He glanced toward the corral, where his horse stood calm, its head lowered, and beyond that, the field that had given him little for as long as he could remember. And though it looked the same, though the ground was still dry and the fences still leaned, there was a sense now that it was no longer resisting him, no longer something he worked against, but something he stood with. He turned back toward the porch where she stood, her eyes on him, and for the first time since she had stepped into his life, there was the slightest change in her expression, not a smile, not quite, but something softer, something that did not need to be named. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice low, "you will see." And Ethan did not ask what she meant, did not need to, because whatever had been set in motion was no longer waiting for his understanding, only for his patience. And as the night fully settled over the land, quiet and wide and unbroken, Ethan Cole realized that for the first time in years, he was not thinking about what he had lost, but about what might finally begin. Morning came without announcement, just a slow change in the color of the sky that crept over the land like something careful not to disturb what had settled during the night. And Ethan Cole was already awake before the light fully reached the horizon. Sitting on the edge of his porch with his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the stretch of ground where he had pressed the soil into place, not expecting anything dramatic, not expecting anything at all, because out here, nothing ever changed overnight. The air felt different first, cooler, carrying a faint scent that did not belong to dry seasons or empty fields, something softer, something alive. And Ethan stood slowly, his boots pressing into the dirt as he stepped down from the porch, each step deliberate, as if he were walking into something that might disappear if he moved too quickly. He stopped a few feet from the spot, his gaze lowering, and for a moment it looked exactly the same cracked surface, the same quiet stillness. But then he saw it, small, almost easy to miss, a thin line of green breaking through the earth where nothing had grown in longer than he cared to remember. And he let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his hand lifting slightly before stopping midway, not touching it, not disturbing it, just acknowledging it as real. Behind him, the door creaked softly, and he did not need to turn to know she was there, her presence as steady as it had been from the beginning. And when she stepped beside him, her gaze fell to the same spot, the same small sign that something had changed in a way the land itself had chosen. "It begins small," she said quietly, and Ethan nodded once, his eyes still fixed on that fragile line of green, because he understood now that it was not about how much had changed, but that it had changed at all. The wind moved across the field again, brushing through the dry grass and carrying that same faint scent, and Ethan lifted his head, his gaze sweeping across the land, and though most of it still looked the same, still worn and tired and waiting, there was a difference in how it held itself, not resisting, not empty, but open, as if something had been returned to it that it had been missing for a long time. He turned slightly then, looking toward her, and for the first time, there was a question in his eyes, not spoken, not urgent, just present, and she met his gaze with that same calm steadiness, the same quiet understanding. "Why me?" he asked after a moment, his voice low, not demanding an answer, just giving shape to something that had been forming since the moment he stepped into that town. And she considered him for a brief second before answering. "Because you did not choose based on who she was," she said, her words simple, unadorned. "You chose based on who you are." And that settled into him deeper than anything else had, not as praise, not as reward, but as something he would carry forward without needing to speak it again. Ethan looked back at the land, at the small green shoot that had pushed through dry earth without asking permission, and he understood then that nothing had been given to him that had not already been possible. It had simply been waiting for the moment he stopped looking away. The sun rose higher, light spilling across the field, catching on that small patch of green and stretching it into something that felt larger than it was. And as Ethan Cole stood there in the quiet of his own land, he realized that the life he thought he had been living had not ended the day before, it had begun. not with the grain he failed to bring home, but with the choice he made when no one was watching, a choice that asked for nothing and returned something that could not be measured, only lived.